Hi, I'm Kate Klein, and I just got back from a conference in Sweden. We are a member of the International Cities of Refuge Network, which is a network of cities all over the world that do the same kind of work that we do, bringing writers in from other countries for residencies. So I'm really pleased and excited to introduce you to Raad Rahman, who's become a friend and a bright spot in Ithaca for the last month. She's been here as our first short-term writer in residence, spending a month living here in Ithaca, meeting with classes at Cornell and Ithaca College, doing a couple of public events like this, and hopefully getting some writing done as well. So Raad is a journalist, a novelist, an essayist, and a human rights advocate from Chittagong, Bangladesh. She comes to Ithaca as a writer in residence, hosted by Ithaca City of Asylum. Currently based in New York City, Raad has worked for media and human rights organizations in the United Kingdom, India, Jamaica, Hungary, and the US. She focuses her fiction and journalism on bringing repressed stories into the open. She received death threats in Bangladesh for her writing on LGBTQ issues, and fellow journalists surrounding the same stories there have been murdered. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Paris Review, The Guardian, and several other publications. She holds a bachelor's degree from Bard College, so she's no stranger to upstate New York, and she earned a master's degree from Central European University in Budapest. You do quite a bit of journalism where you report on factual events in many places, actually. Raad just traveled to Puerto Rico, and she'll be reporting on that. How do you decide when to report on something factual for a newspaper and when to tuck something into a fictional story, and what's the difference for you?
When I'm working on journalistic articles, I've realized that I've only started to speak up when very drastic things have happened around me, and I felt as though the ground kind of gave way, and I needed to walk the walk of being a human rights advocate, because I did human rights work in several countries for several years, and I was always behind the scenes. So that's kind of how I decide on journalistic things. When I see a story that I wish I knew more about and nobody's writing it, I've written it. And so I feel as though there's just so many stories to be written, and there's just so much great work out there. And if people are not writing about certain topics, and I can, I'm more than happy to do it. With fiction, I've always thought of my fiction as being more truthful than my nonfiction. There's definitely a lot of my mother in my stories, and certainly fiction gives me a lot of peace. I think you can discuss things through fiction that you can't necessarily discuss through nonfiction. It's a whole different world, and I mean, my characters don't always do what I want them to do, but it's kind of amazing to just go down that road and create something that just doesn't exist anywhere except for in my head. It's definitely exciting to be able to do that.
Is it based on historical events?
The novel is set in early 2016. So at this time, Bangladesh was going through its highest point in terrorism and terror attacks. So during the course of that year, I think there were about 40 people who were killed in terror attacks, and around 13,000 people who were arrested by the government, and we don't have any knowledge of what happened with these arrests and where those cases are.
Who are the terrorists?
These terrorists are Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and local groups as well. And the Bangladesh government claims that it's just local groups, but it's foreigners coming in from Middle Eastern countries and training locals as well. because all of the country's opposition has been kind of forced to go underground. So it's kind of, when I said the novel, I wanted it to be in that time period where there is this surge and this just very horrific series of attacks. And the Japan thing was interesting for me because there, in one of the biggest terrorist attacks of 2016, there were 9 Japanese people who were killed. And they were killed for being Japanese. And the setting of the novel, for it to be around that time, also in Chittagong, I think matters because Chittagong has become the place where there are several extremist groups functioning, and they have the largest following. So I wanted to set it there and talk about those borders, particularly now, because the kid's father is killed for being married to a Japanese woman of Burmese descent. Yeah. And there was really a deflection of foreignness in Bangladesh going on at this time. I wanted to address that.
I wonder if you could say a few words about the work that you have done and what you have discovered about the LGBTQ activists in Bangladesh.
So a few years ago, I moved back to Bangladesh to work with UNICEF. And while I was working with UNICEF, I reached out to a friend who works in the State Department. And through that friend, and actually that friend's mom is here in the audience today. Through that friend, I met Zohaz Manan, who is one of Bangladesh's leading LGBTQ activists. Was one of Bangladesh's leading LGBTQ activists. And I met him socially. He was one of my good friends. We hung out every weekend. And he wanted to start this magazine called Bukban, which was going to become Bangladesh's only LGBTQ magazine when it was published. It had 2 publications, and then he and his friends, they published a number of other poetry anthologies, dramatized plays, and wanted to become more visible. They were doing it in a setting where Bangladesh was less likely to be able to receive this new desire for visibility. So one of the things that he did was he organized this thing called the Rainbow Rally, and it was a visual protest where during the Bengali New Year's Day celebrations every year, there's a parade, and the gay community decided that they were going to just join in the parade. And they were going to join in the parade with wearing all the colors of the rainbow. But each of them would wear a different color, and they formed a flag with their bodies. It was really beautiful, but then 2 years into doing this, the police told them not to take part in that exercise in 2016, in April. And when some of the boys showed up anyway, they were arrested, and Zoha stayed with them until well after midnight, and then he was followed home by the terrorists that night, according to the intel that we discovered later. And 10 days later, he was hacked to death in his own house, alongside his friend Mahbub Rabi Tonai. And they were hacked down in front of Zohaz's mother, who has extreme Alzheimer's. It's the only time in my life that I've been grateful that someone has Alzheimer's. It's just, yeah. But in the immediate aftermath of the murder, there was a lot that happened. The entire community was forced underground. Several people were hiding in safe houses provided by various embassies. The Swedish, the German, and the US embassies being the primary ones that offered safe housing for the gay community. And the co-founder of the magazine actually was, we couldn't find him for several hours. We had no idea where he was. Eventually we found out that he had escaped into India with a backpack and just $500 in his pocket. And I remember when I spoke to him that day, he asked me to write about it and to also help fundraise to get him help. So that's kind of what I did. I wrote about the murders, and I interviewed the co-founders of the magazine, and the only interviews that they gave to the international media ever since the murder. And I just, it was, and at the same time I started working as a Bangladesh country advisor for this law firm called I Pro Bono. And we helped relocate several of these men into fellowships across the world, into programs where they could be safer, so that they could still continue their work. But right now, the LGBTQ community is really suffering in a way that they haven't suffered before because of Bangladesh's leanings towards conservatism. And it's an election year this year, so it's quite likely that it's going to get even worse for them. There were 28 men who were arrested last year for being in a gay party. And then when the police and the local politicians realized that there was so much international media attention on this, they charged the men with possessing, I think, 25 sacks of marijuana. A lot of these boys, they're doing some brilliant work, so I still try to support them, and I'm helping them publish a book that they're working on right now, which is Zohaz's last project. And so we're trying to realize the impact that he had on the community, and also keep his legacy alive.
How do you define terrorists in the Bangladesh context?
It's a great question, and it's a very complex one. There are several factors involved in the growth of Bangladeshi terrorism. On one hand, the government has outlawed its opposition, so there are parties that feel disenfranchised and as a result have gone underground. And there's been an upsurge of two different groups, Ansarullah Bangla Team and also Hifazat-e Islam. These two groups are both okay with violence as a form of getting political autonomy over Bangladesh, or getting control in any way possible. At the same time, Ansarullah Bangla Team and Salahuddin and Khora, there's these two different groups that came up, and Salahuddin and Khora is such a weird name. It's Salahuddin's army, so they actually see themselves as crusaders, right? They have been getting funding from groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which have actually gone in and established themselves with terror cells all over South Asia, and they call themselves Al-Qaeda in South Asia. It's an expansion of the global jihad, I think, that is being planned on these terrorists' ends. And Bangladesh has become a site and a hub for them because it's an easy one. There are a lot of people who are very uneducated, and if you educate people with food and money, they will listen to you. So there's like it's a breeding ground for a lot of brainwashing, I think, that goes on. And religious schools are a big thing. The largest gathering of Muslims outside of the Hajj happens in Bangladesh every year. I didn't know this until fairly recently myself. It's called Ijtima, and it happens every January. Really frightening time to be in Bangladesh if you don't believe in religion, because all the streets are shut down. You can't even get to the airport if you want to leave, so you're stuck. But as a country, Bangladesh's version of terrorism can be defined as such with the spate of killings that happened after 2012, where a series of bloggers and then human rights activists, also a Hindu priest who was picking flowers one day, about to go in for his puja. These people were murdered. There was an Italian man who was murdered for being white. There's just been a spate of all of this, and a list of 84 individual names were released by these terror cells after 2012. And 2012 is also a big point in the country's history because of the country was prosecuting war criminals from 1971 war crimes with Pakistan, but it became a witch hunt of the opposition. And so there, like, very long story short, I mean, there were protests done by bloggers for a lenient sentence that was passed on a known war criminal. And though it was a witch hunt, there was a lot of support for tighter sentences from locals. And as a result, all these bloggers became quite prominent. And the first murder that happened, the first terror attack, was of a blogger outside of his home. And it was very precisely executed as well. A group of men show up with machetes. They all escape in militant fashion. Just like Zohaz's murder. There were video cameras from surrounding buildings that show 5 men running away in a single file with exactly 2 feet between them. It's very militant. That's new. I think that's where it becomes quite more likely to be called a terror attack than just a regular violence.
Could you give a little more historical context why Japanese people are secular? It's also religious.
No, actually, Japan gives Bangladesh a lot of money, aid money, and Bangladesh as a country survives on NGO funds. Japan is JICA, the Japanese aid organization, is the second largest aid providing organization in the country. So there's always a lot of Japanese people who come in as, Japanese expats who come into the country, either to work or to help out in different programs that they're implementing, whether it's, usually it's infrastructural, but then in recent years it's also been, Uniqlo has factories there, so there's a Japanese textile presence as well. The other people who were killed were Italians as well, who were in the garments industry. There's one American.
So is it just foreigners that are singled out as
Foreigners, locals who hang out with foreigners, anyone who terrorists think are alien to what Islam is, so people like me. I think anyone who doesn't go alongside this very rigid view of militant Islam could be a target. But since 2016, Bangladesh has taken some steps to avoid such attacks. The biggest one happened in July 2016, and there's been a couple since then, but nothing of that size. 22 were killed in July 2016.
I was wondering if you, as a fiction writer, whether you've tried to understand the motivations of those who are inflicting this kind of terror on others.
As far as motivations go, I'm not sure I will ever understand what motivates someone to kill someone else, or in that ghastly fashion, when you're hacking people to death. But there's just been so little heard from liberal voices within Islam, and when we are heard, we're usually asked to speak for all these other groups, like what could motivate them to go down this road. And honestly, I don't know. So yeah, that's something that I am trying to explore myself, because people do expect me to know. So I'm trying to figure it out myself, like what motivates them. Yeah.
What is the role of the Bangladeshi government in all of this?
In terms of freedom of expression, Bangladesh's stance is to try and curb it as much as possible. So in terms of supporting journalists who have been killed, or liberals who have been killed, there have been press conferences held by the Home Minister where he's gone on record to claim that we can find out why people are getting killed by looking into the writings of those who were killed. And that's kind of blaming the murdered victims for their murders. That's what they did with Zohaz's death as well. They said they're writing about homosexuality is criminal and illegal and punishable by Article 377 of the Constitution, which is a section of the Constitution that criminalizes homosexuality, but he expanded it into speech act and not just sexual act. And just by saying that, like writing about it is criminal. Since 2016, Bangladesh has passed new laws where the ICT Act, the Information Communications and Technology Act, indicates that if you hurt religious sentiment, quote unquote, you can receive a 2 crore taka fine or 14 years in prison, which is a life sentence. And 2 crores, I think, is around 1.2 million US dollars. Yeah, so that's the cost of free speech in the country. And as far as the terrorist situation goes, Bangladesh has worked a lot with foreign governments, and like the U.S. government has been their ongoing partner in curbing terrorism. But there's a lot of corruption in the system. And with the ICT Act, for example, the first person who was arrested was someone who was criticizing the prime minister, and a super paramilitary force landed on his house with AK-47s in hand for doing that.
When we were in Bangladesh, we saw these truckloads of, I think these paramilitary forces dressed all in black with their face like this.
The Raad, yes.
And you just saw their eyes. Could you explain, because at the time that was making a lot of my liberal friends very nervous.
Yeah. The Raad was formed by the previous government. They're a super paramilitary force. They are responsible for around 4,000 or 5,000 extrajudicial killings since they were formed in 2005. And they were formed as a counter-terrorist measure. But, you know, as seems to happen in a lot of South Asian countries, counter-terrorism is used as a way of promoting extrajudicial killings of opposition parties. And the Raad, I remember they were acting like a moral police, especially around, I think, the time that you were in Bangladesh, which was, I think, 05, 07, where they would come and they, oh my God, I remember a couple of my friends, they went to the beach one time and they had this very strange encounter with the Raad, where the Raad got mad at them because they were an unmarried couple who were holding hands, and made them like hold the ears and like sit up and stand up like for an hour or something, which is so crazy. Like, who are these Raad people? And then if they showed up at various events, they often did so by just showing up with AK-47s, and they have like sunglasses and bandanas. They look creepy. They act creepy as well, and they shoot on the spot, and they have the jurisdiction to shoot on the spot, which is kind of scary because it takes away due process of law.
People targeted, made to feel unsafe because of their affiliation with a type of person, the artistic people, literary people, educated people, or is it, or you just called to task for specific things you've written or things you've said or art you've produced?
I think it's a combination of both. I think you do get called out to task for certain things that you've written, but some people just get called out for everything they write. Yeah, and it's kind of widespread as well. I mean, on one hand, the Bangladeshi government is passing all these laws, but on the other hand, Al-Qaeda has gone on record and said things like they are going to target Bangladesh's newspapers if they continue to write about LGBTQ issues. And 2 years down the line, all the articles that I read at the time to inform my own pieces and to provide background for my own pieces have now been taken down. So there's just, it's a very complex situation. Yeah.
Blogging as a form of literature in many countries of the world where people don't have computers or typewriters, or how does it work that a blogger can communicate with thousands of people inside a country Is it with cell phones? Is it,
I think it is with cell phones for the most part. Internet penetration in Bangladesh has risen exponentially in the last couple of years. It's an untapped market. There's 162 million people in the country, and if you can provide internet at an affordable price, there's a lot of people that you can provide it to. Like just between 2011 and 2012, for example, there were 300,000 people using the internet at the beginning of 2011. At the end of 2012, there were 3 million. So it's happening very rapidly, and I think blogging, I don't know if I would call it literature, but I appreciate where blogging can get you, particularly in Bangladesh. I remember I started a blog just for venting about how much I was not enjoying my time in polluted, dirty Dhaka. And then local newspapers asked to reprint several of those articles, and Al Jazeera contacted me about one of them, and Georgetown University contacted me about another one. So in a country where there's such a dearth of information about what it is to live there and be there, anything that you put out there, whether it's in Bangla for the locals or in English for a wider audience, it will get read. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and for being here this month.
Thank you.